So, when the Ottoman Empire jumped into World War I, they launched all these ambitious attacks on a bunch of different fronts. But, instead of getting those quick, glorious victories they were hoping for, these campaigns started a total cascade of failure. A failure that would seriously weaken the empire, completely reshape the region, and honestly, set the stage for one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Our story really kicks off in the Caucasus Mountains with this one single, staggering number, 100,000. That's how big the Ottoman army was that they sent marching into the frozen wilderness to take on the Russian Empire. And this wasn't just any army. This was the Ottoman Third Army, led by the incredibly ambitious Enver Pasha himself. And their goal? Oh, it was huge. They wanted to win back all the territory the empire had lost to Russia in a previous war. It was this massive gamble to try and turn back the clock on decades of decline.
But of those 100,000 soldiers who marched out so confidently, this is the number that made it back from the Battle of Sarikamish. Just 18,000. I mean, think about that. That's a loss of over 80% of their entire force.
But here's the thing. The deadliest enemy out there wasn't the Russian army. Nope. The vast majority of these men weren't even killed by bullets. They were taken down by the absolutely brutal Caucasian winter, by frostbite, by starvation, by sickness. This whole thing was a logistical nightmare. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a full-blown catastrophe that left the empire's entire eastern flank wide open and really lit the fuse for all the crises that were about to come. So, with the Caucasus front completely shattered, the conflict immediately spills over the border. The Ottoman High Command, totally desperate to get some momentum back, pushes its already weakened forces into neutral Persia. And just like that, the region gets dragged into the war and becomes this chaotic new battleground.
And you can really see the chaos just by looking at the timeline. In January 1915, the Ottomans actually catch the Russians off guard, and they take the key city of Tabriz. But by the end of that exact same month, the Russians have already taken it back. The fighting just seesaws back and forth until April, when an Ottoman force gets decisively beaten at Dilmun by Russians and Armenian volunteers, losing thousands of men. This whole Persian adventure just turned into a costly sideshow, draining away men and supplies the empire absolutely could not afford to lose.
So, as these military disasters are piling up overseas, the pressure cooker back home is just about to blow. That humiliating defeat at Sarikamish needed an explanation, right? Someone had to take the blame. And this search for a scapegoat, well, it would soon turn into something much, much darker.
To distract everyone from his own catastrophic mistake, Enver Pasha and the ruling party, the Committee of Union and Progress, they pointed the finger inward. They started pushing this narrative that the empire's Armenian population was a fifth column, that they were secretly helping the Russian enemy, and just like that, military failure was twisted into a justification for persecuting their own people.
And you have to understand, this wasn't just some spontaneous thing. It was a systematic, step-by-step escalation. First, Armenian civil servants were fired from their jobs. Then, Armenian men serving in the army were disarmed and thrown into forced labor battalions. Pretty soon, raids and killings became common. The governor of Van, a man named Javdet Bey, even demanded that 4,000 Armenians volunteer to go start uprisings in Russia. When they refused, he ordered reprisal killings. You can see how, step by step, political scapegoating was turning into organized, deadly violence.
All of this simmering tension finally just exploded in the city of Van, which was a major hub of Armenian life in eastern Anatolia. Faced with escalating violence and the very real threat of a massacre, the Armenians in the city decided they had no choice but to resist.
I mean, the odds were just completely and totally stacked against them. On one side, you had multiple Ottoman military police units, you had artillery, you had entire infantry divisions nearby. And on the other, fewer than 1,500 Armenian fighters with just a few hundred rifles and hardly any ammunition. They were surrounded, they were outgunned, and they were literally fighting for their lives.
On April 20th, Javdet Bey ordered a full-on siege of the Armenian parts of the city. The defenders fought for every block, every house, while their leader, Aram Manoukian, put together a provisional government and sent desperate calls for help to the Russians. The Russians finally launched an offensive in early May, and as they got closer, the Ottoman forces just broke. On May 17th, Javdet Bey abandoned the siege and fled.
But that relief came at an absolutely horrifying cost. When the Russian forces finally secured the area, they reported that over 55,000 Armenians had been massacred throughout the province of Van during the uprising and siege.
And the armed resistance at Van? That was then used by the Ottoman government as the final justification for what they did next.
On May 27, 1915, they passed the Temporary Law of Deportation. Now, on paper, it just authorized relocating the Armenian population for military reasons. But in practice, secret oral orders were sent out for the mass murder of the deportees, with the ultimate goal being to reduce the Armenian population to a tiny fraction of what it once was.
And while this unbelievable tragedy was unfolding in the East, the empire's bad decisions were catching up with it on every other front. The failures in the Caucasus and Persia, they weren't isolated incidents, not at all.
Way down south, another top commander, Jamal Pasha, was publicly boasting that he was going to conquer Egypt and cut Britain's vital Suez Canal lifeline to India. He launched this really ambitious raid across the Sinai Desert in February 1915. But the attack was just easily beaten back by well-defended British Indian troops and warships. Jamal Pasha had to order a full retreat. Another huge offensive had ended in a quick, embarrassing failure.
And it was the exact same story over in Mesopotamia, what we'd call modern-day Iraq. The Ottomans tried to push the British out of the key port city of Basra. The commander there, Suleiman Askeri Bey, put together a force to attack the British camp at Shaiba in April. Well, the attack was decisively crushed. Facing the shame of defeat, Suleiman actually took his own life. The British now had a firm grip on southern Mesopotamia.
So, what do we see when we start connecting the dots between the Caucasus, Persia, Egypt, and Mesopotamia? Out of all that chaos from the first few months of the war, a very clear and very disastrous pattern starts to emerge.
The anatomy of this failure, it's pretty consistent. First, you've got these bold, overly ambitious attacks launched with almost no real planning. Second, you have supply lines that are stretched way past their breaking point. I mean, just look at what happened at Sarakamish. And third, the result was always the same: incredibly heavy casualties that the empire simply could not afford to replace. These weren't just defeats, they were massive strategic blunders that were bleeding the empire dry of its men and its resources.
And all of this brings us to a really crucial question. The empire had been battered, its armies had been decimated, its resources were drained, and this is just in the first 6 months of the war, which really leaves you wondering, after a series of catastrophic failures on every single front, how could this weakened Ottoman Empire possibly stand a chance against the massive storm that was about to break on the shores of Gallipoli?